Welcome to IDRAC 2023. My name is Shyla the Super Gecko, and I'm standing in for the wonderful Sue Ellen Hartsong, who cannot be with us today. When I was asked if I could fill in, I found reading Sue Ellen's introduction, we have a lot in common. We are both members of VAI, Sue Ellen having the privilege of being the editor of the VAI Facebook page. I think the link will be included in the chat in a moment. Not seeing any text. And is there going to be text? I'll tell you what, I'm sorry to take up time here, but I will put in some text maybe. So when I was asked, I found we had a lot in common. We both have diabetes, degenerative disc disease, and PTSD. Sue Ellen is a retired 911 dispatch supervisor in the physical world, and I served as a volunteer emergency responder until my disability. Today, in her place, I have the pleasure of interviewing Keri Gray. The following is the text and questions Sue Ellen prepared for Keri's interview. Keri Gray is a cancer survivor, entrepreneur, speaker, and facilitator. She is the CEO of the Keri Gray Consulting Group, LLC, where they strive to create professional communities of understanding through disability and racial justice education. She's also the founder of the National Alliance of Melanin Disabled Advocates, the Named Advocates, which creates spaces for disabled leaders of color and BIPOC allies to gather, learn, connect, and grow around racial and disability justice. Keri's work has been featured in Teen Vogue, the New York Times, People Magazine, Time Magazine, PBS NewsHour, Madame Minoir, and the Diet Coke campaign, Pound Unlabeled. We will have a question and answer time at the end of our interview. If you would please hold your questions for Keri until then. And Keri, welcome. Nice to meet you. What things do you want to share with the conference attendees today, Keri?
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me and for that introduction that you gave. I'm so excited to chat and connect with everyone today on Second Life and do this event. We're gonna have a good little time while we are together. I'm excited. Now, the applause was hitting just as you was asking that question, and the way my hearing loss is set up. Can you were asking? Can you say it one more time? What would I like for folks?
What would you like the conference attendees to know today? What would you like to share with them?
Yes. Okay. Well, first I think I'll start with some introductions. So the work that I do is related to the intersections of racial and disability justice. I identify as a Black disabled woman. I'm hoping my avatar is giving y'all the feels and the vibes of what I mean by that. And before I kind of get into my mission, the purpose of what I do, I think it's helpful to understand a little context. So for me, I'll say it this way, that sorry, what do I want people to know? I'll say it this way. So for me, I come from the great state of Texas, depending on how you look at it. And I always love community spaces. I always love being around Black and brown communities. That's where I grew up. That's what I was surrounded with. I love the nature and the essence of the way in which we talk, we move, our culture. But I also grew up on the other side of the railroad tracks. Quite literally, for anyone who's been in the South. And I learned very on that there were some disparities in the ways in which certain communities are treated. There was disparities in terms of our education. There was disparities in terms of access to groceries, all sorts of things. And so in my line of work in which I do when it relates to racial justice, I knew advocacy had to be a big part of that. How can we, address the gaps of what we're seeing? In addition to that, I was diagnosed with cancer when I was 8 years old, as you kind of mentioned in my bio intro. And I didn't really have a lot of disability representation around me. I ended up having an amputation on my right leg. I have a prosthetic limb. I have hearing loss and different things. And I just wasn't sure how to navigate that identity and the consequences of that as I often covered it up. And it wasn't until I hit college and I got familiar with an organization called the American Association of People with Disabilities. I wonder how many folks are familiar with AAPD. They have this incredible internship program. And I found the disability community for the first time, and I was blown away. I was blown away by how much history there was to our movement, how many fights there were for transportation, for access. Like I just fell in love, and I knew that the advocacy that I was doing for racial justice had to start intersecting with disability justice. So in my line of work today, I do a couple of things. I want to create spaces for us to be able to openly talk about our identities, to be able to talk about the issues that relate to, racial and disability justice. How can we create spaces where we can learn from each other? And I don't say that like lightly, because sometimes talking about identity politics can be rough, right? It can be challenging to talk about race relations. It can be challenging to talk about, if folks have never been in spaces talking about disabilities, you don't always know what to say. So I think it's imperative that we are, creating conversations, educating folks about these issues. But the biggest thing that I'm pushing for right now is the intersectional piece. One of the things that I've seen is for years, I spent time working with racial justice efforts on one side of the pond. On this side of the railroad tracks, you deal with racial justice. On the other side of the railroad tracks, you deal with disability justice. And I think for me, when you ask about what do I want people to know and understand about this work, I think it's about how do we collaborate? How do we think about intersectional efforts in a way that does not perpetuate the segregation that has been going on within our communities? So I'll just open with a little context on that front.
Thank you. The next question I have, and that Sue Ellen wrote, but I like it, is what is named advocates, and how do you help others?
Yes. Thanks for asking that. So the Named Advocates is the National Alliance of Melanin Disabled Advocates. And we are a network and a platform that advocates towards the liberation of BIPOC disabled people. So for us, we actively believe in practices of Black liberation and liberation that centers the experiences of BIPOC, Black and brown people with disabilities. We actively believe that we can like dismantle racist and oppressive systems that have not traditionally been for us, right? And earlier, as I was describing in my story, you can see where that comes from. You can see from the experiences of people across our country who grow up in neighborhoods that are disproportionately impacted, the ways in which I think about Judy Heumann, and for those of you who know her name and when you hear about her story and the ways in which she had to navigate the segregation of disabled children in our school districts, like it is inspired by the idea of what happens in our everyday community and how can we transform that, right? And so the named advocates, is one of those spaces that became really intentional and really intentional, particularly around 2020. The notorious year, of 2020, and we saw in that year that it started to reprioritize people's principles and understandings around disability justice, right? The pandemic happened, and we saw that people had to think about health equity and safety and all of these different things in ways that they had never considered before, right? We also saw the disproportionate ways in which 2020 was impacting Black and brown communities and disabled communities in particular. Not to mention, 2020 was just a year. It was the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that was going on during that time. And for us in that space, we were wrestling with a couple of different notions. We were wrestling between what I would say is the need for safety versus the need for revolution. And I say that because, I mean, again, I know y'all remember, but when 2020 happened, it was a scary time. It was a scary time thinking about how was this pandemic going to be impacting disabled people, our underrepresented communities. You did not want to get sick. It was important to quarantine. It was important to be safe. And at the same time that was happening, people were literally in the streets protesting and talking about the experiences, the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other names. Like, we were wrestling between that need for safety versus that need for revolution. So in the midst of that, it was myself and one other and another incredible advocate named Justice Shorter, Black blind woman, just does incredible, amazing work. And we got together and we said, what can we do in this moment, knowing that folks across our community are wrestling with those two issues? And so what we did was we made a call to our community on June 6th of that year. And we asked people to come out and protest and join the collective protests that were happening that summer. And we had an in-person team that were willing to go out and be a part of it. And then we also had a virtual team of folks who were like, we're not going to be able to make it in person, but still want to be a part of this. And so for us, when we did that call, we were amazed. Like, people showed up. We had about 100 folks just a couple of days later, with a couple of days notice, showed up to protest in front of the White House. We had a team of about 40 people who were working in the virtual digital organizing efforts. We had ASL interpreters, medics, lawyers, snacks, waters. It was so hot outside that day. Like, our community just came together. And that experience helped to build one of our core principles when it comes to the named advocates today. And that is our commitment to cross-movement organizing. For us, it is about shifting how social justice movements understand disability and contextualize ableism. Disability justice lends itself to the politics of alliance. right? And so the named advocates became a place where we didn't want people to feel like they had to choose all of the time between, are we focusing on racial justice efforts, or are we focusing on disability justice efforts? And we find that too often we are pitted against each other. We are put into positions to try to name, is feminism more important? Is racism more important? Is disability justice more important? And we wanted to find a way to reject that, quite honestly, because when it comes to someone like myself, a Black disabled woman, you want to be able to show up and fight for your full self every single time. So for us, it is about creating spaces, creating programming, when our advocacy is occurring, when we are looking at a political power that we are trying to build across our community, when we are looking at the programming that we are building even in our digital spaces. How can we collaborate? How can we bring as many different groups, as much diversity into the space as possible? Frederick Douglass says, quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." And so for us, I feel this is a place where we are really struggling with within the disability community, is how to diversify our efforts. We have to be thinking intentionally about what is the collaboration efforts, what are the causes that are going to bring us together, instead of perpetuating again the segregation that we have seen across our country and across our movement.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes, and in a minute, I'd like to hear what else you'd like us to know, if you can do that, and then open it to questions, because I'm mesmerized. So I thank you. But yeah, is there anything else you want us to know before we open to questions?
Anything else that I want you to know? I think I would just name, a call to action. Based on our discussion today, I know we only had a little bit of time, and one of the things that we're imagining right now is the future of our movement. Where are we going in terms of disability advocacy? And it's such a pivotal time to be imagining that, because we know what 2020 was like. We know all of it was so much that was going on during that time, and we had to shift and pivot and be super, super flexible. And now that we are almost entering into 2024, we are entering a new wave, and we are starting to see people who are adjusting their workplace practices. They are making active decisions about, how much time will we spend in the office? How much time will we spend in virtual spaces and remote spaces? What will our commitment be to underrepresented groups, given our commitments that were stated, particularly in 2020, when we talked about our commitment to health and disability justice, and when we talked about our commitment to racial justice? What does that look like in this new wave? Right? And so I think it becomes imperative for us to have conscious discussions and conscious collaboration efforts, because we are literally shaping we are not going to be pre-COVID. Right? We are not going backwards to prior to the times of 2020. We are already seeing the drastic shifts of the amount of spaces that are changing. They're closing down real estate offices because less people are doing that. It's all of that. So in the midst of this, I want to encourage people to do a couple of things. I want to encourage everyone to find a political home. I want to encourage everyone, this upcoming year, we're going to have a significant year. We're going to be dealing with the election. Civic engagement is going to be incredibly important. Y'all saw that there's legislation that is starting to be passed even more on AI technology. There's all sorts of things that are being determined and shaped right now. I want to encourage you to find the places that teach you about your principles to this work. What are the organizations that are talking about disability justice, racial justice, that are able to ensure that you are in tune with the experiences of people and the progression that is being demanded and asked of us? So the first thing I want to recommend is finding your political home. The second thing I want to recommend for everyone is to create a culture of care. I want to encourage that. We are dealing with accessibility in these days. And I even think about my introduction to this space. When I got invited to this conference, it was folks were so caring towards me. Like, thank y'all for making sure, like, how do you set up in Second Life? How do you get your avatar? Like, working with each other to create accessibility and to create and integrate racial justice is imperative. The environments that we create is a key piece to that. And then the final thing I want to mention is to as a call to action is asking one to bring innovation in the disability justice movement. We need that more than ever right now. I think it is no secret that disability justice is behind when it comes to the efforts that are happening in DEI spaces, right? Like, we know the progression when it comes to racial justice, when it comes to the feminist movement, when it comes to LGBTQ rights, all of these things be important. And disability is one of those spaces that still gets not talked about enough. It is not understood enough. It does not have enough visibility. And so we need that innovation. We need the folks who are designing, who are thinking out of the box, who are building our movement to the highest capacity that can be, because we need that innovation to not only catch up, but to really be able to be integrated into society. So I'm really excited for the future of what that can look like. I'm happy to collaborate with folks in that process. And I just want to say thank you again for having me today.
Thank you, Keri. At this point, I'd like to open it up to a Q&A. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat, or if you're going to voice, just pop in. Here's one. Keri, I bet this is your first time being interviewed by a gecko. Welcome to the virtual world. Question. I know you have presented to large physical audiences and also on platforms like Zoom. Can you compare an SL presentation with a physical world or Zoom audience?
Sorry, again, just to make sure, can I compare like the digital convening to the physical, like being in person?
Yeah, can you compare what it's like to do a presentation in SL versus the physical world or a Zoom type audience?
Yeah. You know what? It's interesting because again, when I think about 2020, when that hit, everything went virtual, particularly in my world, right? Where I was pre-COVID, I was constantly in in-person spaces, and I definitely had Zoom meetings, I definitely had calls, but it was less about that and more about like the in-person convenings. And so when 2020 hit, everything became virtual. And it was honestly it was great in a lot of ways, right? Because more people were able to participate on a consistent basis. They didn't have to think about travel arrangements and, conflicts around there. And I was working with organizations that had staff all over the country, sometimes all over the world. And the virtual digital convening just made it that much more accessible for folks to be a part of it. And then some of the accessibility of digital platforms has been growing as well. So, the more that folks were starting to use AI generated captions, and that made it so much better with being able to convene and talk to folks and just the different accessibility features. So I love a good digital space. I love a virtual space, and us being able to design the environment such as this and name it has been incredible. But I will say that there's a lot of power in the physical world, as we know, and seeing people in person and being able to build relationships and intentional about what you do in the physical space. There's still something that it's irreplaceable for me. It's still very, very irreplaceable. So I think we're very much in that phase of hybrid realities. And data has shown us that, pre-COVID, I think we were operating at about 30% of our workplace was hybrid, but now we're seeing over 50% of our workplace is hybrid. And so I think that's what we're looking at right now. How do we have this model that shares that we can continue to really, utilize these types of spaces in addition to having those in-person connectedness as we can, I think is also really important.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I don't think I saw one pop in, but if you have a question, maybe we take one more. Anyone?
Luke had a question.
Luke did. Thank you. Thank you for reposting. Luke says, you asked, where are we going in terms of disability advocacy? Would you consider bringing that movement into Second Life and the other virtual platforms that make up the metaverse? In my opinion, many of these virtual platforms actually harbor a high level of prejudice because many users simply see it as a virtual space game, a place where people and their feelings are not real. And as such, they do not need to behave like moral humans here.
Interesting. I super appreciate you sharing that. I wish we had more time to really kind of dig into that because that's a good one. For me, I definitely agree with your sentiment. I think it's imperative that we are building disability communities and advocacies across Second Life and across metaverse spaces, because that's where our world is going. We are becoming more and more digital, more and more virtual over time. And, I don't think we see a world in which that is going away. And one of the things that we know about virtual spaces is that, and as much imagination as we put in them, as unique as they are, there are still a lot of things about the virtual space that replicate like, the physical world and society. And that means that our virtual spaces will still require advocacy. It will still require advocacy to ensure that they are accessible, that as people are building virtual spaces out, that they are thinking about disabled interactions. So sometimes that means about like the representation of our avatars. Can I be disabled in the digital and virtual world if I so want to be? Right? And sometimes that is about being able to just be able to utilize the places and the functions, or is the remotes that we are building, the handheld devices that we're building, the headsets that we are building, are they going to be accessible for all different sorts of people? So I think it is imperative that we are building disability spaces and advocacy both on a social front to be able to explore our digital lives and meanings and existence, and also in the sense of rights, in the sense of being able to have access. I'm excited, and I think one of the things I will also mention is your note. I love how you talked about how people can discredit, the virtual space. I definitely think there is a lot of still mainstream education that needs to occur around what it means to engage in virtual realities. There's generational gaps around that. There are also just like, folks who've not been on it as much. And so I think it's important to like educate folks, get people engaged and active. But also for me, I love to spend my time in spaces that are open, who are open-minded about like, yes, I want community. I'm curious to learn. I think that there are enough of us out there who are interested, that we just need to find each other and build and connect. So I think it's 100% essential that we are building disability spaces and advocacy within virtual realities.
Thank you, Keri. I really do want to thank you too. This has been really informative and motivating, and so thank you for coming. And let's see, I believe up next is the arts panel at noon, which is now. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks again.